Klaas Kraay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Miles. It's good to see you.
Why do so many people see antipathy or contradiction or inconsistency between God and the multiverse? What's the issue
Yeah,
supposed to be?
yeah, great question. So, probably a lot of your viewers have heard of multiverses in the context of a criticism of an argument for the existence of God. So, maybe I'll just briefly run through that. And I know you've had other interviews on this, so maybe your viewers are well familiar with it. There's this thing called the fine tuning argument, right? And it says, hey, listen, life is really improbable. Things had to be just exactly so in order for life to be permitted or possible in this universe. And doesn't that suggest the existence of some sort of cosmic designer, maybe God, right? And then an objection to that, a famous objection, probably the most famous objection to that, is to say, well, here's another explanation. Suppose that there's all these different universes that vary maybe randomly in their natural laws or their initial conditions. It wouldn't be at all surprising if there were one or several universes that were life permitting in a scenario like that. So if there's good independent reason for thinking there's a multiverse, that seems to undermine whatever force the fine tuning argument has. So that's kind of like the more familiar context where your viewers might have heard of this sort of stuff.
Mm. And how does this relate to an adjacent concern, which is just cosmology in the beginning of the universe? Because it's not just the specific fact of fine tuning that the multiverse is often thought to explain without needing to appeal to God, but if our universe began to exist, one response is, well, God created it. But then another is, well, our universe is just one part of a much wider physical reality, the multiverse. So what's the dialectic? What's the relationship there between multiverses and uh, also then
Yeah,
undermining an appeal to God with just the beginning of the universe?
good, right. So suppose you think that the universe had a beginning and you think that that supports theism in one way or another. One objection to that is to postulate, think of a kind of sequential multiverse, right? You've probably heard of big
Mm.
bangs and big crunches. Maybe before the big bang, so to speak, there was this whole other thing that crunched, right? So if there's an infinite regress of big bangs and big crunches, whatever the scientific reasons are for
Mm.
postulating such a thing, if that's plausible, then that counts against the claim that there's a beginning to the universe. And insofar as that's used in some arguments for theism, then it would pose a problem for those arguments. Yeah, good.
Right. So, okay, I think one important question, which is actually going to prove very difficult to answer, is how we define universe and multiverse. What do these words mean here? I think the problem with just straightforwardly answering that is that those terms come up in multiple contexts, some of which are wildly different from one another in scientific, cosmological contexts, or in very abstract philosophical contexts. So maybe let's just start with scientifically, when one appeals to a multiverse in the way you have, or with respect to fine tuning, what is a multiverse? What does that mean?
Yeah, good. So I can't really answer the question scientifically because that's not my training here.
Fair.
But the way people in the literature that I'm familiar with use the term is usually like it's some sort of a spatio-temporally interrelated aggregate that's causally close. So there's no kind of causal connections or spatial or temporal connections between different universes. So
Right.
you've got this kind of aggregate, right?
Right.
Beyond that, the scientific accounts are, of course, above my pay grade here, but that's the
Mm.
thought. If it's helpful, I could say something about possible worlds versus universes, because that might help to clarify things for viewers.
Yeah, so let's start there because what we want to do is look primarily at multiverses in the philosophical context. So walk us through this distinction which between a possible world and universes because for most people those terms are going to seem very similar. So we'll start there.
Yeah, and it might even be worse than that. It might seem that a universe is bigger than a world, but as
Right.
philosophers use these terms, it's actually the other way around. So it's a little counterintuitive, so we might as well be totally honest about that. So here's a kind of informal way of talking about what a possible world is. Let's start with the way things actually are, the actual world. So picture everything that exists, everything that did exist in the past, and everything that will exist in the future. Picture all the events that are happening now, and all the events that did happen, and all the events that will happen in the future. All of that together is the actual world. It's the way that things are. right? But of course, things might have unfolded differently, right? You and I might not have had this interview. Hitler might have won World War II, and on and on. You could multiply examples as long as you want. Each one of those alternatives, a different way that things might have been, is what philosophers call a possible world, as you know. So there's exactly one actual world. There's one way that things really are, but there's all these different ways that things might have been, and each one of those is a possible world. Okay, so that's worlds. Now, universes, as they're used in this context, are, as I said, these sort of spatio-temporal, aggregates that are causally closed or whatever. And the thought is, look, suppose the scientists who are promoting multiverse theories are right, then the way things are, then the actual world really includes more than one universe. So although you might be used to hearing universe as this bigger term, here we're saying the way things are, right, if those scientists are correct, the way things are includes multiple universes. So universes are, so to speak, inside of a possible world, right?
Yes.
That's the basic distinction.
Okay. And I should say the key hook here of our discussion is that while there are these two ways in which multiverses are thought to undermine belief in God, actually what we're going to explore now are two ways that appeal to a multiverse potentially reinforces belief in God because it serves to undercut arguments for atheism. And the first of those is going to be the problem of no best world. So all of that is preamble to now our discussion of the first objection to belief in God, or equivalently, the first argument for atheism, the problem of no best world. So, with these careful distinctions in mind, what is the problem of no best world, Klaas?
Yeah, good. So that'll require a little bit of setup, and feel free to interject whenever you like if I don't do it clearly enough. So we just talked about the actual world versus all these different possible worlds. Okay, and there's infinitely many possible worlds, but just one actual world. Okay. Let's make a few assumptions, and they're all going to be controversial, but hey, that's philosophy. Let's assume that all these worlds, the actual world and all the different possible worlds, let's assume that they have something like an overall objective value or status, right? Your people have heard of the phrase or the term the best of all possible worlds, right? Just think about that term for a second. If you think that there's such a thing as the best of all possible worlds, you're committed to the idea that there's a kind of way of evaluating worlds, that some are better than others, right? So that idea is actually fairly familiar. So suppose that all the possible worlds that there are, all the way things might have been, and the actual world can all be given a unique objective value ranking, okay? And that might sound crazy in a way, but here's a way to make it a little bit more intuitive. Wouldn't we say that things would have been far worse if Hitler had won World War II? Wouldn't we say that things would be far better if I could only explain philosophy more clearly than I can, or whatever, right? We're kind of used to the idea, I think, intuitively of talking about ways that things might be better and ways that things might be worse. So the machinery kind of plays it, the technical machinery here plays into that sentiment. So, let's assume for the moment, for the purpose of this discussion, that every possible world and the actual world has an objective value status. Some are better than others, some are good, some are bad, etc. Now, to keep things simple, let's suppose that they can all sensibly be compared to each other, that there are no failures of comparability or commensurability here. And just to keep things really simple, let's suppose for a minute that there are no ties. Okay? So, every way that things could have been, and the way that things are, i.e. the actual world, has this objective value status, and they can all be compared to each other, and there's no ties. So far, so good?
So far, so good.
All right. Now, suppose, I just mentioned this phrase, the best of all possible worlds. Suppose, though, that that's incoherent for a minute, right? So here's the intuition. Things could maybe always be better. Things might have always been better. Maybe that phrase, best of all possible worlds, is meaningless because there's literally no such thing. Okay, well, maybe that seems a little bit strange, but I mean, think about positive integers for a minute. You and I can say the words greatest positive integer all day long, but there's nothing that corresponds to that in reality. It's impossible for there to be a greatest positive integer. Numbers could always get better. And so a lot of people have the intuition, it's probably the prevalent intuition in, philosophy of religion circles, that there's no such thing as the best of all possible worlds. Now, we got to talk a little bit about God. Should I pivot to that, about what God's choice is in the matter here?
Yes. So I guess I'll just state more explicitly. The idea is we've got these two options, given our assumptions that have been built in, two possibilities concerning the array of possible way things might have been. On the one hand, it might be that there is a best possible world. There is a best possible way reality could have been, a termination to our ranking of ever better worlds. At some point, you reach the best. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, in fact, things could always get better. There's instead of a termination to this increasing chain of better worlds, it just goes on infinitely, getting better and better and better and better. And there's no best. And so then the question will be, well, I'll stop you there. So those are the two possibilities for the way that possible worlds are ranked against one another. And so from there, now, we can talk about what this has to do with an argument for atheism.
Yeah, good. So let's maybe, that was a great recap, by the way. So let's maybe start here. So there's lots of ways that God is understood. There's lots of conceptions of who or what God is, right? But let's work with a pretty traditional understanding. So God, let's suppose, is a supernatural, personal being who's the creator and sustainer of everything that there is, and who's omniscient and omnipotent and perfectly good, right? That's a pretty familiar, widespread, influential, important concept of God. So let's go back to that idea of God as the creator and sustainer. Very central idea, of course, in monotheistic traditions. And in philosophy talk, the way philosophers talk about that is they say that God chooses one world to make actual. Okay, so there really is a way that things are, and God is either the sole determinant or the primary determinant of the way things are on theism, if theism is true. So picture it this way, and I realize it's a little strange if you're not used to thinking this way. Picture God looking at this vast array of possibilities. There's infinite possibilities that God might choose, and God can only choose one to be the actual world, right? And God's role as creator and sustainer, let's say, can be understood as actualizing one of those worlds, picking one of those worlds to bestow actuality on. Okay, so that's a bit about God. And now, going back to where we were a minute ago, suppose that all these possibilities can be ranked, and as you said, there's no upper bound. They go up and up and up forever. Now the question is, what world is God going to pick? And that's the question, that's the departure point for this argument for atheism. So far, so good?
So far, so good. So far, so good. Nothing to add. Keep on, keep it on.
All right. So I like to introduce this with by talking about wine, because that might help people to get it. So suppose for a minute that you really like wine. You're an oenophile. You're a wine lover, and somebody gives you this nice bottle of wine, right? So most nice bottles of wine kind of get better and better for a while, and then if you leave them for too long, they get worse. So you're supposed to try to pick the kind of best moment to drink the wine if you really care about that. But now, and this is not my example, this is from the philosopher John Pollock. Suppose that I give you, suppose you're a wine lover, and I give you a very special bottle of wine. It's an ever better bottle of wine. So unlike most bottles of wine that kind of go like this parabola, this bottle of wine gets better ad infinitum, without any limit. And now suppose that I also just make you eternally existing, so it's not like you have to worry about when you're going to die. So you're a wine lover and you're going to live forever, and you've got this very special bottle of wine. Question is, when are you going to drink the wine, right? And I think there's this intuition that any day, week, month, year, millennium that you pick, reason sort of suggests that you should have waited a little bit longer. I mean, you've got all the time in the world, right? You're an everlasting wine lover. So, suppose you decide to drink the wine on Tuesday. It seems like you could have done better, right? You could have made a better choice. What choice? By waiting till Wednesday, because objectively the wine's going to be better on Wednesday. And you could have waited a few more millennia, because the wine's going to be all that much better in a few millennia, right? So the thought is, this is an analogy, of course, the thought is that whatever day you pick to drink the wine, you really could have made a better choice. Certainly could have drunk better wine by waiting, and insofar as you could have drunk better wine by waiting, you could have made a better choice. Probably the analogy is pretty obvious now, right? So God's in a similar position on this model. God has to pick one of these worlds to make the actual world. There's only one way that things really are. And God's faced with this series that looks just like the positive integers, no upper bound, right? So it looks like whatever world God picks, God could have picked a better one. That's sort of baked into the scenario. God could always have picked a better world. And then, just like the wine lover could have always picked a better wine to drink, let's say. And insofar as God could have always gotten a better outcome, the thought is, well, then God always could have performed a better action. What action? The action of picking a better world, just like the wine lover. The wine lover could have done something better, could have had a better action, namely, waiting a couple of weeks or a couple of millennia. So God always could have had a better outcome. So therefore, God could have performed a better action. But wait, now it starts to look like God isn't unsurpassable. It seems like no matter what God does, God could have done something better. Better in what way? I don't know. Maybe more rational? Maybe morally better? Right?
Okay.
The morally better one doesn't track to the wine so well, right? You might say no matter what day the wine lover drinks the wine, it would have been more rational to wait. It's not so clearly a moral thing. But in the case of God, you might say, yeah, you know what? God could have been rationally better. And maybe more seriously, a lot of people are going to say, God would have been morally better by picking a world that was 10 times as good as the world that God picked, or 1 billion times, or 1 trillion times better, right? There's no upper bound. That's
especially when you think that the value of worlds will often largely derive from like the people within them and the lives that they have, the relationships they have, the lack of suffering and evil. It does seem, when you look at it like that, it does seem that God would have been morally superior in picking a world that was 1 trillion times better than this one in terms of lack of suffering and evil and more acts of love and kindness and relationships and lives. So that, I think, brings out that intuition very well.
Yeah, nicely put, right? So, you and I are friends and doing philosophy is great. So those are good things about this world. But there could have been worlds with many more friends and much more philosophy being done. And of course, as you say, less pain and suffering and maybe more beauty and on and on and on, right? That's right. What's driving the intuition here.
Okay. So let's, I suppose, finish connecting the dots. What is the problem then? Right? I mean, I see where we are, but if there's this infinite chain and every world that God creates, he could have created a better one and he would have been better if he had done so. Okay.
So this is an ambitious argument for atheism in several respects. Number one, it's not an argument that appeals to some feature of the world that you got to go out and argue about, right? It's a kind of argument that, as philosophers call it, is totally a priori. You can just do it in your head by thinking about it. And the conclusion is actually quite ambitious as well. The conclusion of this argument is not that there is no God, it's that God is impossible. There's no way that there could be a perfectly rational, perfectly moral being if the choice that God was faced with, if the choice that a being was faced with was like that, right? So it's an argument not just for the non-existence of God, but for the claim that the very concept of God is incoherent, or for the claim that God is impossible. So that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of this being an argument for atheism.
And that's because God is supposed to be, by definition, morally unsurpassable.
Yeah, that's right. So perfect in power, perfect in knowledge. Maybe that includes rationality. God's always going to know what the best choice is, right, and so forth. But in any case, you can add that in. It's plausible enough. God is an unsurpassable being, unsurpassable in goodness, unsurpassable in rationality. Doesn't have to be both of those. Maybe you're not so sure about rationality. Maybe you think that's a weird thing to attribute to God. Well, then stick with perfect goodness. Would a God be perfectly good in picking world number 777 when God could have picked 7 billion, etc.
Right.
World 7 billion. right? So the thought is God couldn't exist in that scenario.
Right. Now, is it I have a paper under review where I had to spend a lot of time trying to disambiguate different versions of this problem that aren't always clearly delineated. Now, the one that you've sketched is what I do call the problem of no best world. It's this a priori, just purely conceptual argument that's not based upon any empirical observations or evidence. It's just thinking through implications and possibilities. But what if we think there is a best possible world? Maybe our world isn't that one, but we think, conceptually speaking, we overcome these objections about integers increasing. There is a way that you could describe reality such that it's the best way reality could have been. Is there a version of this argument that still works there? It seems to me there is, but it's going to look different. There, the case might be that if there is a best possible world, God, being morally perfect and unsurpassable, would obviously pick that world to create. That seems intuitive. If there's a perfect being, perfect in goodness and power, able to create the best possible world, then they would. Anything else would be morally objectionable. But then the problem is our world isn't the best possible world, and therefore God doesn't exist. So you see, there's two versions of this argument but they're distinct. And I wonder if you could comment on that, or if you have any comments.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're different versions of the same argument. I would just say that they're different arguments. The one that we've been talking about the most is the problem of no best world. I would call the one that you just described, which is an argument for atheism and an important one, I'd call that the problem of suboptimality. And what's the problem? The problem is that things look suboptimal around here, but if theism is true, you'd expect things to be optimal. You'd expect the best. Right?
Okay.
Now, it's controversial. What you said earlier, I should note, is controversial. A lot of people think that even if there is a best of all possible worlds, that God is not obliged to make it, that it's not necessarily the case that God will pick it, and so forth. But you nicely sketch the usual intuition. But anyway, that's how I divide up the problems. I wouldn't say two versions of the same problem. I'd say two different problems. If you like, we could say that they're different problems because they have a different backdrop. The first one operates on this backdrop of an increasing hierarchy of better worlds. The other one operates on a backdrop where there's a top of the line. There's a top of the line world, and then the question becomes this kind of empirical question: why isn't this it? Right? And we can have a whole debate about that, of course.
Right. So that would be one important distinction: is that in the case of the argument we've been discussing, the first one, it's purely conceptual. It's just about what you can derive from thinking about these things and their conceptual implications. But the second does involve a substantive claim based upon observations of the world, namely that it's not the best way things could be. But that's not something you can discover just by sitting in the armchair and thinking. You've got to look around. And so that marks an important distinction between the two.
Yes, though I'll put a little footnote in it. I basically agree. The problem of suboptimality is going to involve, in almost all cases, an a posteriori premise, a premise that you can't know just by sitting in the armchair and looking inside your own head. I'll just add two little points. One is that, by the way, just so everyone's clear, that doesn't have to be an argument from evil. Right? This problem of suboptimality says, hey, how come things are suboptimal? You could flesh that out in various ways. It might or it might not appeal to evil, just so people don't think that's necessarily the problem of evil. But the little footnote is, someone pointed out to me once, I'll give him credit, Ian Wilkes, a Canadian philosopher, pointed out to me once that you might think that things are suboptimal just by looking inside your own head and realizing how morally bad you are. Right, so maybe it's not necessarily an investigation of the world, right? Which I think is a fair point.
That's annoying because it undoes my very clean and pretty distinction that I was able to draw. So, all right, I mean, fair.
Counter examples have that role, don't they? Right. So if that's really a priori, if that's just looking inside your own head and saying, gosh, I'm really a terrible person, or the sort of person I am shouldn't be in an optimal world, or whatever, that would do the trick. Anyway.
Okay. All right, fair play. I'll give you that. So we've got this fairly technical argument for atheism that the layperson does not often stumble upon. It's left usually to the philosophers, which doesn't mean it's bad or false. It could prove its point. But what is the theistic multiverse response to this problem? This is where multiverses come in, where they have so much promise.
That's right.
What is it? What does it do?
Or they might have promised. We'll have to see.
Yes.
So there's a bunch of ways to respond to this problem of no best world. So everyone's clear. Problem of no best world. It's this argument for atheism. It seems to show that God is impossible. Well, you could defeat the argument by saying that this backdrop, according to which there's no best of all possible worlds, is just wrong. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe there is actually a best of all possible worlds. I shouldn't say actually. Maybe there is a best of all possible worlds.
Sure.
Right? So some philosophers have tried to defend the claim that the theistic multiverse, so a multiverse picture where God is making a bunch of universes, I'll talk about how many in a minute, is a credible candidate for actually being the best of all possible worlds. So here it is. Let's cut to the chase. Suppose that you can divide universes into those that are worth creating and sustaining and universes that aren't worth creating and sustaining. Okay, suppose that makes sense. I'm sure we'll revisit that, but suppose for a minute that makes sense. And suppose it's up to God as an all-powerful being whether to make 0, 1, or lots of universes, right? If God doesn't create anything, by the way, there's still an actual world, but there's no universe. If there's only one universe and it's actual, and theism is true, then God's created one universe. If theism is true, there's still only one actual world, and if the multiverse theorists are right, then God has created multiple universes. Okay, so go with that last scenario. Suppose theism is true, and God creates a multiverse. And what does it include? It includes all the good enough universes, and only the good enough universes. All of them that are above whatever the threshold is for being worthy of being created and sustained, kept in existence by God. All of them, and none of the ones that are unworthy. I think if that's coherent, now that's a big if that's coherent, that has a pretty credible claim on being the best of all possible worlds. And I can explain why if you like.
Yes.
So, all and only. Here's the model. The theistic multiverse includes all and only the good enough universes. Any world that's going to be different from the theistic universe either is not going to include all the good enough ones, or it's not going to include only the good enough ones. If it doesn't include all the good enough ones, then it seems like it could have been better. If it doesn't, why? By including all of them. If it doesn't include only the good enough ones, then again it seems like it could have been better. Why? By not including this sub good enough universe. So that's kind of a quick and dirty argument for the claim that the theistic multiverse, if it's coherent, if this includes all and only the good enough universes, can't be beat. It can't be surpassed. There's only two ways to surpass it. One is by not including all, the other one is by not including only. If you run through it, it seems like either way would be worse. So, hey presto, we've just built the best of all possible worlds. And if we've built the best of all possible worlds, if that's coherent, then the argument that works on the backdrop of there being no such thing is avoided or fails.
Okay, so this is where things will get confusing, I'm sure, because we're slipping between talking about the chain of ever better worlds, but then we're to imagine a slightly different concept, which is the chain of ever better universes, ranking universes against one another and saying at some point you reach a certain level of value such that every universe above that level is worth creating. And below that, it's not worth creating. It's too bad to create. Above that, it's good enough to create. So, and obviously these two chains are not the same thing, because possible worlds refer to a broader concept where multiple universes can exist in one possible world. So, and I think we've explained that pretty decently clearly, but it's just worth emphasizing the distinction here, because it's so easy to think of possible worlds as possible universes, but that's not correct.
That's right. It's a good clarification. And I don't want to stipulate or claim at this point that the universes get better and better all the way to infinity. Maybe they do or maybe they don't, right? So and maybe this is backing up a step, but maybe this will help, right? Suppose that I'm a coin collector or a stamp collector or whatever, and I want to build the greatest coin collection or stamp collection. So a good way to think through that is to say, well, look, I want to include all the stamps or the coins that are worth including, and I don't want to have any of the ones in it that are not worth including. Right? You can say that, right? Suppose that's coherent. You can say that without committing to the idea that stamps or coins get better and better ad infinitum. Stamps or coins here are representing the universes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's fair. That's fair. So we have this model of God creating all and only the universes worth creating. The natural question, the important question, and the question that many proponents of these models sidestep is what makes a universe worth creating? How good does a possible universe have to be to merit divine creation?
Yeah, watch me sidestep it.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So, you're right. A lot of people don't explain what the threshold is going to look like, and some of the proposals that are on the table are a little bit simplistic. So here's one. Someone might say, any universe is good enough to be in the theistic multiverse if it contains a favorable balance of good over evil. So just a little bit more units of good than there are of evil. Well, I don't know. That seems like kind of a low standard to me. It seems like God could have a much higher standard than that, right? In order to make the story plausible, you probably need to tell some kind of a story about what this threshold looks like, what it means for a universe, to be good enough, to be worthy of being created and sustained. On the other hand, I don't know how much fine-grained detail you really need here. I mean, if you're a coin collector or a stamp collector and you want to build the greatest coin or stamp collection, you have to have some story about what makes a coin or a stamp good enough to be in your collection. But we're talking about very large objects here, and we're talking about God, right? It's a little bit harder to get grips on it as opposed to, coins or stamps or whatever, right? So I'm not sure that the defender of this view owes a super-duper fine-grained account of what it means, of where the line is, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But it can't be a line that seems obviously too low, right? And that's where the philosophy is going to go back and forth.
So I suppose we could just spend a bit more time clarifying what this model asserts, because it's actually quite fascinating. When we think about what all possible universes encompass, and let's grant that there is a meaningful distinction between the worthy and the unworthy universes, how fine-grained is the distinction between universes? It seems to me that on most models of the theistic multiverse, there is, of course, this universe that we inhabit, but then there's also one where there is a close duplicate of me that lives a slightly different life, but otherwise the value of that universe is just like this one, and so it's worthwhile. And so you get this fantastic infinite vision of reality where I don't literally exist in multiple universes, but copies of me do. So maybe you can speak to that. I mean, that's something that proponents of scientific multiverses will often talk about. My duplicates out there in cosmic reality. This is pretty much the same, even if universe might be defined slightly differently. But is that the kind of vision you're thinking of here? This really infinite, expansive, kind of replicating multiverse?
Good. So in favor of that model is the kind of, look, more is better intuition, right? So sure, we're talking about a massive multiverse here with all kinds of universes, some of which are super duper different from the one that you and I inhabit, but some of which are very close to the one that you and I inhabit. And if duplicates are possible, then sure, maybe all the duplicates are there too, right? Infinitely many duplicates of ourselves, infinitely many near duplicates of ourselves, infinitely many different universes where things are very, very different in all sorts of ways. An enormous conception of reality. Reality on theism and on this model of the theistic multiverse is much, much bigger than you might have imagined, right?
Mm-hmm. This would be, I think, Donald Turner's model specifically, where he embraced this idea of infinite duplicates of every possible worthwhile universe. And so it's a breathtaking vision, but it is problematic, I think, on a number of fronts. Perhaps we start with one more abstract issue, which is there's this question of, if this universe is good, this one right here that I'm in, then a duplicate of this universe, an exact duplicate, would also be good. It would just be two of the same thing, and so why should a duplicate be less valuable than the original, if that even makes sense? But then three duplicates would be three times as good, and on and on and on and on and on. And the problem comes, you might say, all right, let's just affirm the logical conclusion here, which is that God creates all possible duplicates of all worthwhile universes. The problem is this. Let's say God says, let there be the best possible multiverse. And there it is. But then God creates one more duplicate of our universe. Well, now it would seem that despite what we had thought, that God created the best possible multiverse, now the multiverse is even better because it includes another duplicate of a good universe. The point is that it seems impossible. It seems incoherent to assert that God creates all possible duplicates of any universe, because for any number of duplicates, for any amount, you could always create more. So we seem to be right back at this issue of not being able to encompass all possibilities within a best possible world. You can always create more. It can always get better. So how would you address this problem of duplication?
Yeah, really good. Good. So first thing I'll say is if it's a problem, I'm not sure that it has to be duplication that drives the problem. Duplication makes the problem vivid, right? But I think the underlying objection is actually this. I've been carrying on as though it makes sense to talk about all the worthy universes, but maybe that just doesn't make any sense. Maybe there's no such thing as all the worthy universes, right? Maybe there's literally no such thing for the very reasons you give, right? Now, it's got to be a mistake to think of God as saying, how many am I going to make? Okay, I'm going to make 1 trillion. Oh, wait, shoot, I could have made 1,000,000,001, right? It can't be like that. God wouldn't fall for such an easy trick, surely, right?
Yes.
God's decree, if God's going to make a decree here, it's not going to be pick a positive integer of worthy universes and actualize that positive integer. God's too smart for that, right? God's decree would have to be something like, let there be all the universes that are worth creating. But of course, the underlying objection still remains. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as all here. Okay, that does seem like an important objection. And if it's correct, then the multiverse solution to the problem of no best world will fail in exactly the way that you suggest, because we'll be right back into this intuition that things could always be better, right? So here are a couple of ways that you might respond to it. I can think of 3 ways that you might respond, and I'm not sure that any of them is really satisfactory. One thing is you could kind of concede the point. You could say, okay, you know what? We were mistaken when we thought about this. It's not that God's going to create every single worthy universe. God's going to create at least one from every type or kind of worthy universe. This is Tim O'Connor's Multiverse, right? I think he says, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he doesn't think that God's going to, blindly pursue a duplication or replication in a vain attempt to reach an upper bound when there's no such thing. God's not going to do that. But God's maybe interested in diversity and variety, and so maybe somehow or other you can divide the worthy universes into different kinds, and a perfectly good, powerful, and so forth being is going to make sure that there's at least some from every kind, right? You can probably guess the problem with this, or one problem with this anyway, is someone might say, well, there's no such thing as all the kinds either, right? Maybe that phrase is actually meaningless, right? For that model to work, you have to concede that there's an objective upper bound on how many kinds or types of worthy universes there are. And I guess you've also got to buy into the idea that it's good enough for God to just make 1 or 2 from each type, right? I mean, this is all sounding super abstract, but in my youth I was a coin collector, so I'll go back to collecting coins, and I wanted to have some coins of each type. I wanted to have some coins are the types of coins are nationality, right? So I wanted to have at least some coins from France and at least some coins from Sweden before the euro, at least some coins from Australia. To my mind, at the time as a kid, that seemed like a pretty good coin collection, right? But it's pretty obvious what the types of coins are. A lot less clear what the types of worthy universes are. When by worthy, what we really mean is worthy for God to create and sustain, right? So you might say it's pretty hard to move from easy intuitions about coins or stamps to these other intuitions, right? That's one response, is to say, basically concede the point and say, okay, it's going to be all the different worthy, at least some from each worthy type.
Right, and that allows you to sidestep duplication specifically because God will no longer be obligated to duplicate. But I guess the one thing to clarify is that I don't think that you need to say there's an upper bound on kinds of universes in order for it to be coherent for God to create all kinds of worthy universes. I mean, wasn't this the original selling point of the first model of the theistic multiverse that we explored, was that it might be the case that there is an infinite chain of ever better possible universes. But nevertheless, there will be some cutoff point above which universes are worthwhile, and God can say, let there be this infinite chain of universes. So it sounded kind of like what you were saying is infinity is the problem. That if the possible universes are infinite, or if the possible kinds of universes are infinite, then God can't catch them all into one reality. But I don't think that's the problem. An omnipotent God could create an infinite number of universes that are arranged ever better without end. So it does seem to me that the only issue here is duplication. It's just that duplication, it seems incoherent to say that there's a point in time at which God creates all possible duplicates, because you can always get more. But that's not quite the same thing as the infinity. Do you see kind of what I'm getting at?
I think so. I thought you were going to say something else there for a minute, but certainly I take your point about time. It's not as though by 7 o'clock God has to have it done. You might say God's going to do this ad infinitum throughout time. Maybe then the intuition is a little bit easier, right? You and I have to do things by 7 o'clock maybe, but God doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe God throughout time can just keep making universes. That's one possible solution. But what I thought you were going to say is that the real problem is this. I don't know if it's the real problem, but it's a problem. And that's that this talk of a threshold doesn't make any sense, right? And I think that's a different objection to the theistic multiverse. Theistic multiverse says God's going to make every universe, above a certain threshold. And that's like this objective, bright line that carves the worthy ones from the unworthy ones. And some people are going to say there's no such thing as an objective line like that.
So that is a different objection, and it's an important one. But I guess I was just wondering what you meant when you said that duplication isn't the source of the problem here. It's just one way of making it vivid and bringing it out. And so I wonder, let's set duplication to the side. Well, then what's the objection, I guess, is what I'm confused about.
Yeah, it's the sort of Cantorian thing. There's no greatest cardinality, right? So forget about duplicates for a minute. Let's just talk about trivially different universes where there's one more grain of sand on one beach or whatever, right? Plausibly, there's no such thing as the set of all of those. Even if there are no duplicates among them, there could always be more trivially different universes, and so that I think gets the objection up and running without appealing to duplicates, right? The basic idea is that God just can't do it all. It doesn't make any sense to talk about all of the worthy universes, whether or not they're duplicates. Trivial differences would do the trick too.
Okay, I see now what you're getting at, and it would probably get too technical if we then go into the nuances of transfinite cardinality. So so we have this first solution, which is to say, actually no, we need to be more coarse-grained in the way we're looking at universes. God only needs to pick one from each kind, and let's just assume there are a manageable number of kinds of universes. And right, there's 7, so that would be one way of doing it. All right, so that's the first way of getting around this. What's the second?
So, yeah, another response, nicely put, by the way. Another response would be to say, sure, there could always be more universes, whether they're duplicates or whether they're trivially different. But at a certain point, more doesn't mean better, right? I back to the coin collecting. Once I've got my, 1 centime French coin from 1972, having a whole bunch more of 1972 1 centime coins isn't going to make my collection any better. Right? So even though numerically there could always be more, maybe there just somehow is an upper bound on things getting better. So then, if that's right, then it becomes meaningful again, I think, to say, look, there's such a thing as the set of all of the worthy universes, that there's some upper bound beyond which, yes, God could make more, but making more wouldn't make things any better.
All right, all right. I just think that view lacks motivation because
It's going to seem super
arbitrary.
ad hoc. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to seem super ad hoc, right? Which is a philosophy speak for under motivated objection, right? It's speculative, right? And I can motivate it by talking about the coin collection analogy, but it's all too easy to say that just doesn't transfer to the divine case, right?
Well, I think one powerful reason it doesn't transfer to the divine case is that in the case of universes, we're talking about, again, conscious agents and the meaningful lives, relationships with God, experiences, beauty, infinitely great lives that God could create. I just don't think these aesthetic concerns with variety trump the increase in value to reality if God creates more people like that in infinitely valuable lives. Surely that's so good and so great. It's worth the loss of the aesthetic value of variety that you'd get in the case of a coin collection. Coins aren't conscious or aware, and so it's just different.
That's right. I didn't want to stake my claim on aesthetic value here in particular. You could just say, look, it's just kind of a brute fact. It's not motivated by appeal to aesthetic considerations, but you could say, yeah, the mathematics outruns the value here. But I think you're quite right. I think the contrary intuition is exactly what you said. This isn't just dumb, unfeeling objects here. These might be people we're talking about. Now, I'm not saying they maybe have a right to exist, but surely there's a strong intuition that a bunch of happy people, maybe happy people who live eternally in complete felicity in the presence of God. Wow, that seems really good. How could it be that adding universes that contain them, doesn't make reality better? Right? That's a hard line to take.
Yes. Okay. So then, just for the sake of completeness, the third possible line of response to this problem, what would that be?
Oh yeah, this. I mean, if you didn't like the last one, you're certainly not going to like this. But so Cantor, the mathematician who gave us transfinite mathematics, was also a theist. I think he was Lutheran, and he took very seriously, God, and he thought actually that there was a level of infinity that actually was an upper bound. So sure, numbers get bigger and bigger, finite ones get bigger and bigger, and without getting into the technical details, Cantor showed us that infinite numbers get bigger and bigger without an upper bound as well. But Cantor seems to have thought that there was a kind of level of infinity beyond all of that. He called it absolute infinity, and that was a way of representing, the value or the goodness of God or something like that. So, super speculative, of course. But if anything like that is right, you might say, well, you want to know how many universes God makes that are worthy of being created and sustained? I'll give you the answer. It's the same answer Cantor gave. It's absolute infinity many. Now, that's not gonna please a lot of people, of course, but that's another way that someone might respond to this.
Well, I don't know why it wouldn't please people, because that's the option that, if pressed, I would go for. That's the one I think is the most plausible and coherent, although many people disagree, but I would argue with him. Because even if we don't have a name for the concept, you have this series of ever greater transfinite cardinals, and you just say that the magnitude or the number of universes is greater than any transfinite cardinal, that its magnitude outstrips any cardinal. And there it is. And so you then have to give some further argument to say that's incoherent. It's not enough to just say, well, the series of cardinals goes on forever. But this is the same problem with just finite numbers. You could say, well, the series of integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, goes on without end, so there can't be an infinite quantity. I don't think we would accept that argument.
No, that's
so
right. That's right.
So I would just say you'd have to give some further argument for why it's incoherent to affirm that there's absolutely infinitely many universes. Now, there are such arguments, but I've got a paper under review where I try to deal with those.
I love it.
I
hope you're right. I think that would be really cool if there were a defensible way to take what I think is a kind of underdeveloped Cantorian intuition and to put some flesh on the bones and to say that's it right there.
So here's a different objection I don't raise in the paper, and I don't know that anyone has yet. Let's just agree that God's multiverse is absolutely infinite, and therefore absolutely infinite in value. How do we relate God to that? As theists, we typically affirm that God is the greatest possible being, that God's value is unsurpassable, that there could be no thing that equals the value of God or outweighs God's value. The problem here is then, if we say that God has created this reality that's absolutely infinite, absolutely infinitely good, what about God? How valuable is God, and have we therefore undermined his status as the greatest possible being? Because now we have this greatest possible world. I mean, these are tough questions, and I don't have a good response to it. But do you have any semblance of an idea of how we could still capture God's unique value in an absolutely infinite world?
Yeah, I wish I did. I don't have even a gesture at an argument here, but I feel the force of the worry. You don't want to. Most theists aren't going to want to go pantheist here and somehow identify God with the creation. I suppose that's. I guess I do have an idea. Okay, fine. That's one thing you could do. You could say God just is identical to this multiverse, and so there's no problem. You're trying to say, shouldn't this one thing be better than the other? The response is, well, there aren't two things. There's actually just one thing. But of course, that's not going to please anyone who's not interested in pantheism. But that's one move you could make.
Yes, and it's funny because that's just that's an issue I decided to ignore for the paper, but it might be very serious, and so it's something to think about. Let's bring things more down to earth here, from our grand heights of absolute infinity. I wonder if this doesn't create certain existential, personal, spiritual issues if each of us is just one member of this infinite ensemble of worlds, many of which are duplicates or near duplicates of this one. There's someone out there that looks and behaves and acts and lives just like me. Many people find that kind of nauseating. And of course, that's not a well-formed objection, but it gets at this issue of how can I be special in a multiverse like this? And if I can't be special, is that a problem?
Oh yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, that's kind of emotional objection. I don't want to live in a world like that, a world where there's ever so many things. I mean, this is just autobiography. I find it kind of an exciting and entrancing scenario. I don't find it, that's not philosophy. That's just reporting some emotions here. I find it super appealing. Suppose you're different. Suppose you find. So what's the worry? You're not special. Is what you said, but why? Suppose theism is true. God loves you and cares for you. You're of profound significance to God. It's not like God doesn't have enough room to care for everybody. It's not like God doesn't have enough love or energy or stamina to care about everybody. I mean, if that's a simple parenting analogy. I have 2 kids, but if I had 4 kids or 8 kids, they'd all be very special to me, and I only have very small powers, right? And my love is far from perfect, but I wouldn't say that you add a bunch more kids and suddenly they're less special to me. I would feel that I have this unique and special relationship with each one of them and so forth, right? An infinite God, where's the problem, someone might say.
So what if it's not so much divine human relationships, but maybe more an angle on the meaning of life? I think whatever people think the meaning of life is, and none of us agree, right? The idea of contributing to the world in a unique way, I think, plays a part in it for some people anyway. There's an intuition that whatever the meaning of my life is, it's got to be something that I'm contributing and bringing to the table that wouldn't have been there except for me. In this infinite multiverse, it's easy to think, oh, what does it matter? What's the point anyway? Any book I write, it's going to be written an infinite number of times out there in the multiverse as well. So why bother? I mean, any life project I adopt, it's going to be replicated an infinite number of times. So that seems to threaten just the meaning of it all. Now, maybe that's limited. Maybe we shouldn't think the meaning of life derives solely from the projects and things I do, but it's something.
Or the cosmic ramifications of the projects, right? I mean, there's a kind of, I don't know, triumphalist historical narrative here that goes something like this. Look, our conception of the cosmos started off as very, very small, in ancient times or prehistory or whatever. And as human inquiry and science has unfolded through time, the world that we can observe and the world that we believe to exist has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And yeah, it kind of bothered some of us every time. Wait a minute, we're not the only planet, etc. But we kind of got used to it, right? Where our position is not as central in the known universe now as it was thought to be in the Middle Ages or in prehistory or whatever. But that's okay. So you might say it's just kind of, I mean, this is maybe too flippant, but it just seems kind of hubristic to say that you only matter if you cosmically matter or something like that. Maybe that's not quite right. On theism, you do cosmically matter. But back to the opposite intuition. I mean, if I write a great philosophy book, never mind multiverses, it's not going to be remembered forever. And by the time we get to the heat death of the universe and our Earth falling into the sun or whatever it is that's going to happen, none of it's going to matter by that logic anyway, right? Anyway. The worry is probably more serious if you accept duplicates. So if you rule out duplicates, then the worry is a little bit less serious, I think, right? You might still be bothered by trivial differences. Wait, somebody had a trivially different interview with a earphone that was just 1 millimeter different, right? This interview is not very special anymore, right? So yeah, you might get the worry going even if there aren't duplicates.
Yes, and so that's something I try to think through at the end of my paper is there a way to argue against trivial, exact and near duplicates and still retain a multiverse that is in some sense the best possible and that can diffuse these objections? And I suggest there are some reasons to think so, but it's speculative and it's not airtight. And it's hard to come up with any solution that really feels right. Every view here seems to have some serious problems. So it's just a question of, okay, which one's the best?
That's philosophy for you, right? I mean, every view in metaphysics or ethics or philosophy of religion has formidable objections, and it's very controversial, right? My not terribly exciting analogy for it is that I use with students sometimes is ironing. You try to iron a shirt, if you're like me anyway. I mean, first of all, you try to avoid ironing a shirt, but if you have to iron a shirt, maybe at best you get some wrinkles out in this little area of the shirt, but all you've really done is created some wrinkles elsewhere. Sometimes I feel philosophy is like that. We get one little corner straightened out, but only, once you zoom out, you realize there are problems elsewhere. That's philosophy for you. That's not unique to theistic multiverses. This is great. I'm having a lot of fun, by the way. Thank you for this.
Yeah, of course. I love doing this. I mean, I didn't know that it would be this great before I started this project, and I realized one interview in, I was like, I'm doing this. This is not stopping. So I enjoy it. I think it's a unique way of doing philosophy that's more fast-paced and just offering a different way to develop ideas than like the written medium.
Yeah.
Right. And reading, it's talking. That's different. So we've talked at length about this more abstract philosophical objection to belief in God. But there's another one that more people will be familiar with than some guys, which is the problem of evil. So what is the problem of evil for theistic belief?
Yeah, great. So it's a bit of a misnomer, first of all, because it really refers to not just one problem, but a whole family of arguments that try to show that there is no God, or there probably is no God, or something like that. What those arguments have in common, though, obviously, is some claim about evil. Either that evil exists, or that a whole lot of it exists, or that it's distributed poorly, or that a certain type of it exists, or that it lasts for too long, or it's too frequent, or something like that. So that's what unifies this family. It's some claim about evil that is thought to be unexpected or inconsistent with the existence of God. Yeah, let me put it that way. So every argument from evil that we'll focus on anyway takes some phenomenon or some claim about evil and says, well, you wouldn't have that if God were to exist. So that's actually an a priori claim. If God, then you wouldn't have that phenomenon. Then the next step of the argument is to say either that phenomenon really exists, or it's reasonable to believe that it exists, or it probably exists. So therefore either God doesn't exist or God's existence is unlikely, something like that. But that's what unifies them all. Some claim about evil, we could talk about the details of that, and that's thought to be inconsistent with the existence of God.
Okay, and let's give just one rough and ready version of that argument to fill in the detail, like the problem of gratuitous evil, for instance.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, right? So some philosophers, just to back up one micro step, some philosophers have said, look, if God exists, there wouldn't be any evil at all. Arguments like that have been thought to be failures, that God might have some reason for allowing some evil to occur. But then the next argument is the argument from pointless or gratuitous evil, right? Maybe there's some evil out there that leads to a greater good. But sure, it looks like there is some evil and suffering and so forth in the world that seems totally without point, that seems like it couldn't lead to a greater good, or it couldn't somehow prevent something even worse from happening, and so on and so forth. And that's what you shouldn't find if God exists. And since we do, or probably do, find there to be pointless evil or gratuitous evil, therefore there is no God, or it's unlikely that there's God, or whatever. That's a famous, influential, and important argument for atheism that appeals to a pointless or gratuitous evil.
And if I recall, the really strong version of this argument, which says that God is logically incompatible with evil, that goes back to Epicurus, right? Where he says if God is all powerful, why he would be able to get rid of evil. If God is all good, he'd want to get rid of evil. And if he's all knowing, he'd know about the evil, and so therefore there should be no evil. He says something along those lines, if I'm right. And that's a very strong logical problem where you aim to draw out some sort of contradiction between the propositions evil exists and God exists. Most philosophers don't affirm that strong argument anymore, which I think is what you were getting at. Rather, they will say that there are certain kinds of evil which are strong evidence against God's existence. The way to cash this out, or to see this distinction, is just to realize, like in a court of law, when a prosecutor presents a case against a defendant, say they're accused of murder, they're not saying that the accused's guilt or the accused's innocence is logically incompatible with the evidence they are presenting. Rather, they're just saying that the evidence makes it likely that the accused is not innocent. That is, that they are guilty. So that's the kind of the progress anyway that's been made in this dialogue about evil. Is most philosophers now think that the best we can say is that evil is strong evidence against God. And that's still a serious issue. So if we have this problem of evil, how is a multiverse relevant to this? What is it thought to do?
Yeah. What we're talking about is how one might use the theistic multiverse to respond to the problem of evil. And here are to arguments from evil. Here are two things that people have said, and I now think they're both wrong. They're kind of two equal and opposite extremes. The first one is to say, well, that's it. The multiverse completely solves the problem of evil. And I don't think that's right, and I can say something about that if you like. And the other extreme is to say that the multiverse doesn't make any difference at all to the problem of evil. So I can say something about, should I talk about first one and then the other?
Yeah, so let's talk about why one might think the multiverse solves the problem of evil. I think there was one philosopher, last name McGill, contending that the multiverse, a theistic multiverse, it solves every version of the problem of evil. So that's a very strong claim.
Yeah, every actual version, every possible version of the problem of evil. I mean, that would be quite something. That would be like a philosophical triumph, the likes of which you never see, right?
Right.
So his thought was that it's a universe is good enough to be in the theistic multiverse if it has more good than evil in it. And then he also said, well, look, never mind other universes. Our universe is really, really big. It's very difficult for us to know if there's more good than evil or more evil than good or maybe precisely the same amount. So in short, for all we know, there's more good than evil in our universe. And therefore, for all we know, our universe is good enough to be in the theistic multiverse, so therefore every argument from evil fails. I just don't think that can be right for a variety of reasons, but the main one is this. I'm not sure that standard is the right standard, more good than evil. If there's like 51 units of good and 50 units of evil, that doesn't seem like it might be the only or a good enough standard for God, right? It might not just be about having slightly more good than evil. There might be some things that happen in this universe that you can credibly say should not happen if theism is true, right? There shouldn't be a Holocaust, even if in the grand scheme of things there's ever so slightly more good than evil in the universe. God still wouldn't allow the Holocaust, right? That's a totally understandable reaction here. So I don't think the multiverse is that powerful. I love the theistic multiverse, but I don't think it can solve every version of every argument from evil. The opposite extreme is, and this is what I used to think, is that it makes no difference at all. I used to think that, maybe as a reaction to the first extreme view that I mentioned, but I used to think, look, any argument from evil can just get translated into this talk of whether our universe is good enough. So whatever feature you think exists or probably exists in reality that shouldn't happen if God exists can just be characterized as a feature of this universe and can be given as a reason for thinking that this universe doesn't belong in the theistic multiverse, right? So if that's right, then the whole problem of evil discussion just gets translated into a discussion about whether our universe is good enough. So no substantive difference, just a big translation exercise. I now don't think that's quite right either.
It's funny because I'll have to amend my quotations because, well, the paper where I do agree with you that it makes no difference, that's already published. That's done. So that, to me, I found your
I'm a moving
case,
target.
I found your case convincing that the theistic multiverse solves adjacent problems like this problem of no best world, maybe suboptimality. But when it comes to the good old problem of evil, it seemed right to me to say, yeah, the atheist will then just shift and say, well, our universe is not worthwhile. It's not worthy of divine creation for reasons X, Y, and Z. And those X, Y, and Z reasons will be equivalent to whatever it was that motivated the problem of evil in the first place. Okay, so I'm curious why you don't think that anymore.
I don't think, I now think, are we still good? One of us glitched there. Maybe both of us did. I now think, okay, good. I now think that the multiverse story might make a small difference to the problem of evil discussion. That is, it might help the theist a little bit. So first I want to clarify something. In this context, the theist who wants to wield, is wield the wrong word? The theist who wants to wield or deploy or invoke the theistic multiverse in response to the problem of evil doesn't have to be talking about the theistic multiverse as we were earlier in this interview as about being a candidate for the best of all possible worlds. So all that stuff we were talking about before, could it really include all of the worthy universes? That isn't relevant here, or it doesn't have to be relevant. Why? Because you could invoke the theistic multiverse in response to the problem of evil without committing to this further claim that also, by the way, it's the best of all possible worlds. You have to commit to that further claim if you're going to invoke it against the problem of no best world, because the way to defeat that argument is to say, hey, there is a best of all possible worlds. In the problem of evil discussion, you don't have to go for that very dramatic conclusion. Okay? So, I haven't answered the real question yet. The real question is, how could it make a difference? So here's an analogy. Uh, Suppose you're on death row. Terrible thing to think about. Suppose you're on death row and they give you, as they do in the movies, your one last meal, and you can pick any meal you like. Boy, you're gonna really think for a long time about what you want. You've got this one shot, right, to have this really terrific meal. You're gonna think long and hard. You want to pick the best kind of meal that you can. Switch the analogy a little bit. Now suppose you're at some resort and you're at this big long buffet, and you're trying to think about what's good enough to include on your plate from the buffet. Seems to me that it's defensible to have slightly lower standards when you're at the buffet for what's going to go on your plate versus the death row example. In the death row example, you've got this one shot, right? One universe. That's the analogy, of course. You want to make it as good as it possibly can be. If we're talking the buffet, I mean, I'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I don't want to say, my standards for what gets to go on my plate might just be a little bit lower. Something might be good enough to include as part of a larger ensemble or set that might not be good enough to select if it's the only thing that you can pick. That's the intuition. That's the analogy. Applied to universes, the thought is this. Maybe if God can only make one universe, the standards are going to be a lot higher. The expectations are going to reasonably be a lot higher from human beings, let's say, than if God can make a whole bunch of different universes. Maybe they don't have to be quite so good to be worthy of including, just like the dishes in the buffet can be okay to include, even if they're not, the best possible meal or whatever. So that's the application of that analogy. It might lower the standards a little bit, and that, all else equal, is going to help the theist, right? The higher the standards, the harder it is for the theist. So if this analogy is credible, if this move can work at all, then it's going to lower the standards a little bit, which is going to maybe give a small advantage to the theist. I'm not saying advantage over the atheist yet. I'm saying advantage relative to where the theist was before. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. To make things simple, like in a toy model here, if there's the best possible universe, then if God's only creating one, seems pretty likely God ought to create the best possible universe. Obviously, theists will disagree sometimes with that intuition, but it's reasonable enough. But God can create 10 universes. They don't all have to be the best possible. One of them perhaps is the best possible, but then that allows God to create maybe 9 below that as well. It doesn't seem he's under the same obligation to actualize only the best when there are multiple options. But now, even as I say that, I wonder if God's got 10 slots in his multiverse, shouldn't he create 10 variations on the best possible universe? Rather than...
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So like
Good.
at the buffet,
Yeah.
if there's a best possible meal there, you should fill your plate with that one.
Yeah.
Rather than
Good.
only just part of your plate.
So that's exactly, as you know, I'm sure that's what some people have said in the literature, right? God is going to make a whole bunch of copies or trivially different variants of the best universe instead of also including a bunch of ones that are not the best. Again, let's suppose there's a best. Well, that actually tees me up nicely to talk about the second possible advantage that could come to the theist here by invoking the multiverse. It might open up the possibility of an appeal to things like diversity of universes or aesthetic value of there being different kinds of universes that you couldn't appeal to if there's only one universe that God's going to pick, right? So we're talking about, just to back up a second or to zoom out for a second, we're talking about what are the relative advantages of a multiverse model versus a single universe model in responding to the problem of evil. If you go with a multiverse model, you can talk about the value of diversity. Maybe there's beauty that comes from having multiple universes. Maybe just more is better. Maybe it's plenitude, right? And to your point about why wouldn't God just endlessly duplicate the best one or whatever, maybe there's value in diversity. Maybe there's even aesthetic value. I'm not saying this is going to solve the problem of evil. I'm just saying that this opens up an avenue that the single universe theist can't exploit, namely diversity or the possibility of aesthetic goods or whatever at the universe level. Single universe theist can't appeal to that. Multiverse theist can appeal to that. How much ice it's going to cut, I'm not sure. I don't think the prospects of it are super huge, but I do think it might open up the possibility for a new kind of appeal that couldn't happen on a single universe model. If people want to look at the details here, Hud Hudson is the person who runs this. Hud Hudson offers a kind of aesthetic theodicy, or an aesthetic response to the problem of evil, invoking the idea that multiple universes bring about aesthetic goods that you couldn't get on a single universe model. It's very speculative, of course. He's not saying for sure that he knows that it's true. He only wants to argue that we don't know it to be false. But he thinks it might make a small contribution to the problem of evil. And I think he's right. I think he's right that it might make a small contribution to the problem of evil.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's reasonable anyway. And I'll think more about it, but I think I probably agree with that. That you get some help to the problem of evil.
Yeah.
But it's not like a decisive response to specific versions that appeal to gratuitous evil or deontologically impermissible states of affairs or things like that. It's just kind of a broad scale push in a direction that feels a bit more favorable to the theist.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's another arrow in the theist's quiver, so to speak. But whether that arrow is going to hit the target, maybe I'm extending the analogy too far, is an open question. But I think there's another reason, though, that I think cuts a little bit more ice. So I can mention that if you like. Mm-hmm. So, as you know, and as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, one of the most famous responses to a bunch of different arguments from evil it's called skeptical theism. But here's what it boils down to. The problem of evil can be understood as a search for whether there are plausible reasons why God might allow certain evils to occur. And one famous response is to say, why would we human beings think that we're very good at discovering what God's reasons are? God might have reasons for permitting evil that are too big, too vast, too complicated, too intricate for us to be able to even dream of. So maybe we've looked at all the different reasons that we can think of for why God might be justified in allowing evil, but what reason do we really have to think that that set of reasons that we've looked at and maybe found wanting is a representative sample of all the reasons that God could possibly have? The so-called skeptical theist is someone who says, we have no reason at all for thinking that our examination of reasons so far is a representative sample of all the reasons that God might have, so we shouldn't be very confident at all that God would have no good reason for allowing this evil or that evil or this much evil. So that's a famous move in the problem of evil literature, very controversial, of course. But what I now think is that appeal to the theistic multiverse might be a kind of force multiplier. I think that's what some tactics are called in military talk, a force multiplier. I think appeal to the multiverse might be a force multiplier for skeptical theism. So lots of people defend skeptical theism just in this universe, but if reality is way bigger, if reality includes all these other universes, maybe not every single one, as I said earlier, but let's suppose it includes all these, many, many more universes that are worthy of being created and sustained. Doesn't that give us all the more reason to suppose that our grip on what reasons God might have for allowing evil isn't terribly firm? That there might be far more to reality than is dreamt of in our philosophy, that there might be far more reasons that God might have that we can't have access to. That intuition seems a little stronger, or a little more plausible, or has a little more teeth on the theistic multiverse model. How much? I don't know. Skeptical theism, very controversial for all sorts of reasons. But if it has anything going for it, this might help the case for skeptical theism.
So let me ask you a more personal question. This is the final step of bringing it down to earth. in terms of just the person now, from our grand heights of the absolutely infinite multiverse to here. What what got you into thinking about the multiverse and its relationship to God? I mean, just in your own life, what were the biographical details of how you got here?
Um, I I'm trying to remember exactly where the multiverse came into it, but I'll go a step or two farther back. I went to university thinking I was going to be a lawyer or something like that, some sort of very straightforward thing that I could imagine as a teenager. And then I took my first philosophy course in first year, and I was totally blown away. I thought, this is it. This is the stuff I need to be thinking about and doing. And then in my second year, I took a philosophy of religion course, and then the lights went on one more time, and I said, this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. This is the way to think about these deep and important questions. And of course, I was introduced to arguments for and against the existence of God and the problem of evil and all this stuff, and I thought that was just amazing. And the person who taught that course wound up becoming my PhD supervisor, and was a very formative influence on me. And yeah, the multiverse stuff that came around later. I certainly wasn't the first person to start thinking about this stuff. I guess I read Donald Turner's paper and a few other things, and I kind of got interested in it at that point. But I don't remember the whens or wheres of that as clearly as I do first getting into philosophy and second getting into philosophy of religion in particular.
Mm. Now, one of the implications of our discussion here that I think people will see at some level is that philosophical progress, if it happens slowly. That for any viewpoint or argument, there are always plausible sounding objections, and one pessimistic outlook or inference to draw from all of that is that this isn't going anywhere. It's not going to make progress. Now, what do you think about that? I mean, I also am in philosophy, and so I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. But one thing that does trouble me is this question of, whether we can actually make real headway into answering these fundamental questions. And if we can't, is there another way to think about progress? That'll be one of the last questions I leave you with here. Is what do we think about philosophical progress in general? Is it a real thing?
What is it all about? I wish I had a really good, innovative answer. I don't know that I have anything terribly surprising or profound to say here. It just seems like kind of a cheap move. Philosophers haven't, they can't agree on anything, so therefore there's no progress. That doesn't seem like a good inference, first of all, from the fact that there's no widespread agreement. It doesn't follow validly that there's been no progress. One thing you might say is, well, we've found a bunch of dead ends, right? We've ruled out certain bad views, and there's a lot of agreement on which views aren't credible. Maybe not perfect agreement, but we've ruled out some. Another move that people make in this discussion, as I'm sure, is to say, look, whenever an area of philosophy gets pretty well worked out, it starts getting called something else, right? Natural philosophy is now what we call science. It got carved off once its methods got really rigorous and so forth. It got carved off. Psychology only left the philosophical fold, I don't know, in the last 100 years or 150 years or whatever it's been. So it should be no surprise that the areas that remain are the most difficult areas where progress is the most difficult and where things are the most complex, because all the other ones got hived off and started being called something else. Anyway, that's another move that people say, but I share the worry. I don't want to give a glib answer here. I think we should worry about it. It's a kind of pessimistic induction. Most philosophical views are failures, so why should we think that any philosophical view currently is going to be anything other than an abject failure? It's definitely a thing that we should worry about.
I definitely think that the kind of progress philosophy makes is subtle, but I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it in my own investigation into really specific questions about looking at the research over, say, even just 20 years. There's a lot of conceptual clarification that you get as time goes on. Like, I think about something listeners might be familiar with is discussion about the Kalam cosmological argument. If you look at Craig's reformulation of the argument in 1979 to now, we understand the issues, the relevant issues, and their implications so much more than we did back in 1979. And I think even the atheist and the theist, even the proponent and the critic of the argument, can recognize that level of progress, that we've really clarified the conceptual landscape to a profound degree. And I have to believe that that plays into a closer approximation to the truth.
Yeah. And you could certainly say the same in arguments for theism about the fine-tuning argument and the ontological argument. The technical machinery that's involved in these arguments is just not what it was 10 years ago, a generation ago, or half a millennium ago. So absolutely, you could say there has been progress. What occludes it or makes it difficult to see is that it's often it's tied up with specialization, right? The progress is easier to detect at a moderately or very highly specialized level. And that just isn't always apparent to, the first-year undergraduate or the layperson. The layperson goes, what? They haven't figured out the meaning of life yet, or they haven't figured out ethics yet? I mean, what is right and wrong anyway? But the specialist knows that we have a pretty well worked out view of different kinds of ethical theories, or, different views about the meaning of life, or technical assessments of various arguments for and against God, or what have you. So, yeah, I think specialization, this very interview is meant to resist a little bit the thought that philosophy should only occur at a highly technical level in the ivory tower or whatever. But a lot of specialized technical work does go on, and I think there's an awful lot of progress there that the specialists can see that maybe isn't always so clear to the person on the street, so to speak.
Right. Well, Klaas Kraay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Listeners won't know this, but I have to thank you again for, I think it was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, I cold emailed you out of nowhere and said, hey, I've written this paper on the theistic multiverse. Can you read it and help me? Because I want to publish it. Now, I've since published other ones. That one is still working its way through, but it was very charitable.
Don't blame me for that.
Right, no. It was very charitable of you to help me when you didn't know me, and I appreciate that. So thanks for coming on today.
Well, happy to do it, and thanks very much for the opportunity. I mean, I was looking at some of the other folks you've interviewed for this podcast, and it's a real honor to be included in that set, and it's a great joy to talk with you about this stuff as well. So thank you very much.